Hi, my name is Brooke Ingersoll, and I am really excited to talk to you today about Project ImPACT, which is a parent-mediated intervention that I developed with my colleague Anna Dvorak. And today I'm going to be talking a bit about ways in which we can use parent-mediated interventions to increase social communication skills in young children with autism and related social communication challenges. I'm going to be talking a bit about the need for this type of work, as well as the specific strategies that we've developed and packaged as part of Project ImPACT and some of the research on it. And my hope is by the end of this talk, you'll have some familiarity with this particular approach. And also there's another talk today by my colleagues Jeanette Newman and Melanie Palacia that will also talk a little bit more about what this Project ImPACT looks like actually in practice in the community. So I encourage you also to see that talk. To get started, I wanted to make a disclosure that I am a developer of the Project ImPACT curriculum, which means I receive royalties from the sale of the manuals. I do donate my portion of the royalties to the research that I'm going to be talking about today to support a better understanding of how this program works and how we can improve it to help families with children with ASD and related social communication challenges. So I wanted to start with an overview of what we mean by when I use the term parent-mediated intervention. This is a term that we see a lot in the intervention literature. Similar terms are things like parent-implemented intervention, parent training, parent education. I actually really like the term parent-mediated intervention because I think it really clearly denotes the role that the parent plays in the intervention process. So I wanted to start with an overview of what we're talking about when we're talking about parent-mediated intervention. This is an approach to intervention that involves systematic instruction to the parents in strategies to help them accomplish specific goals or outcomes for their child. And we see this type of intervention approach used in a variety of childhood developmental challenges. We see this used for children with developmental delays. We see this used for children with behavior problems. We see this being used for children with medical issues. But what I'm going to be focusing on today is the use of parent-mediated intervention for children with ASD and related challenges. And in this area, we see this type of approach being used to improve the parent-child interaction, to really help support parents in being able to interact with their child more effectively and build social interaction. We also see it being used to teach specific developmental skills. For children with autism, this often is focused heavily on social communication, but we also see it focused on things like self-help skills and adaptive skills. And then finally, we see this type of approach being used to help parents manage their child's challenging behavior. When we look at the use of parent-mediated intervention for children with ASD, we see that it is considered an essential part of a comprehensive intervention program. So going back to some of the earliest work done on intervention for children with autism, ABA, we see earliest work really involving parents so that they could help learn the strategies and carry them out throughout their child's day. And there have been a number of technical review panels that have evaluated the literature and have suggested that any comprehensive intervention program for children with ASD should include some element of parent-mediated intervention. But we also see PMI being used as a primary intervention strategy, meaning for those children who may not be receiving comprehensive services, maybe very young children who don't quite meet criteria for a formal ASD diagnosis yet, maybe for children who are receiving services in a community setting where they don't provide intensive services, such as Part C. We can see in those areas parent-mediated intervention can be the primary intervention approach that is used with children. When we look at the parent-mediated intervention process, it differs from the way a traditional child-directed model works. So with PMI, we see a shift in practice from expert delivery to a partnership with a parent. And what I mean by that is that we're shifting from the provider being the expert who works with the child to the provider bringing their own level of expertise and recognizing the parent's level of expertise and partnering together to help the family improve the child's outcome. And really what we're doing as a coach, or the provider is working as a coach to really help the parent develop skills and the confidence that they can change their behavior in order to change their child's behavior. So what that looks like is that the provider's role is less of an implementer of intervention and more focused on collaborating with the parent to develop goals for the child that the parent feels very committed to, and then helping the parents learn and use strategies with the child in their daily routines and life. And then the goal of that is that the parent can then use those strategies during their daily routines and interactions with the child to promote their child's development. So for individual providers who have not had a lot of training in parent-mediated intervention, it feels very different from the way they are likely providing services. And so here, with the parent's role to use those strategies during their child's daily interactions with the child, again, here this is a bit of a shift where in a more traditional model, the parent is sort of there to support the provider, whereas here the parent is really the primary implementer of the intervention. So when we look at what are the outcomes for children with autism who've received parent-mediated intervention, we see that there are improvements in a variety of skills that are associated with this. So we see improvements in social communication, adaptive skills, and behavior, and there have been a number of studies that have looked at this. We also see generalization and maintenance of skills, which is really important because we know children with autism in particular have difficulty with generalization. And we also know that interventions that focus very heavily on that are very heavily child-directed improve skills often, but only in those environments in which those skills are targeted. So by increasing parent involvement in the implementation of the intervention strategies, we do see improvements in generalization and maintenance of child skill. And then finally, PMI has been shown to be time and cost effective, meaning it requires less provider time to achieve the same level of outcome. And this is because the parent is being taught strategies that they can then carry over throughout their child's day. What I think is really important to consider, though, is not just child outcomes. We know children with ASD are members of their family, and we know when we look at individuals with ASD across the lifespan, we see that their families continue to play a very important role in their well-being and their adjustment across the lifespan, and more so than we see for neurotypically developing children. And so it's very important to think about intervention being aimed at not only the child, but also the family. And one of the really nice things that we see with parent-mediated intervention is that families who participate report an increase in parenting self-efficacy. And this is a really important sort of psychological process that basically allows parents to feel competent in their ability to parent their child. And parents who've received parent-mediated intervention typically see an increase in that level of self-efficacy. We also see, relatedly, reductions in parenting stress. And we see parenting self-efficacy and parenting stress being highly correlated. So parents who tend to feel more self-efficacious typically experience less parenting stress. And this is really important in the treatment of children with ASD, as we know families of children with ASD experience significant stress when we compare them to children with other special health care needs. So any intervention that can serve to reduce parenting stress and increase parenting self-efficacy is going to be very important for promoting positive family adjustment. And then finally, when parents have been trained in intervention strategies to support their child, it also leads to more positive, broader family interactions. And so we're really thinking about how can we improve the interactions within the broader context of the family. So based on all of this literature, there have been a number of technical review panels that have looked at the evidence base, and it is considered an evidence-based practice. And this is, has been reported since the National Research Council first published the book on educating young children with autism, but it's also been endorsed by the National Standards Project and the National Clearinghouse for Autism education programs. So these are all strategies, these are all groups that suggest that parent-mediated intervention is an evidence-based practice and should be part of a comprehensive program for children with ASD. There are a number of good parent-mediated interventions out there for children with ASD that show either a strong or an emerging evidence base for their ability to promote social communication skills. And here I just have some examples of various parent-mediated interventions that have been developed for young children with ASD that primarily target social communication. And I'm focusing on this because this is where most of the research has been conducted. However, I want to acknowledge there are also a number of parent-mediated interventions for children with ASD that focus on behavior management, such as the Ruby curriculum, that also have a really strong emerging evidence base. But what I want you to notice here is there are a variety of programs to choose from, and this is excellent. So they all are targeting social communication challenges. They kind of all fall into a broader class of interventions called naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions, or NDBIs. And you can see that they vary in terms of their length and their intensity and the format in which they're conducted. So some are individual, some are group, some can be implemented either individual or group. And I didn't put this up here, but there is now a new emerging strategy, which is the use of remote instruction or telehealth. And so a number of these programs also have developed some variation of telehealth delivery. And what you can see here is the key features that they share are all of them meet weekly or more than once a week, so between 1 and 3 times a week. And they typically are somewhere between about 8 and 36 weeks. The ImPACT trial was the kind of the outlier, but they also met less frequently. So you can see here that they are meeting frequently and they're relatively high intensity during the training period, but they are time limited. So the fact that there are a number of these programs available is really promising when we think about trying to get community providers to use parent-mediated intervention in their work with families. I have little asterisks here around some of the programs that actually have published curricula that providers could go and purchase to help support their use of the program. And so what we can see here is there are a lot of options to choose from. They have slightly different lengths, they have slightly different intensities, their formats are slightly different, which suggests that providers should be able to find one or more of these programs that can fit within their intervention delivery model. So one of the things I've been very interested in my work is really trying to understand how to move what we know to be best practice or evidence-based interventions into routine community practice. And clearly we're not new in thinking about this. This is a struggle for all intervention, which is, you know, a lot of times things are developed in labs or research settings. And then they work really well in those programs, in those research environments, but they're not really well integrated into routine community use. So it's been very important to try to understand how is this being used in the community and what can we do to facilitate better use. So when we look at how parent-mediated intervention has been implemented in the community, we see a couple really good signs. It is very valued by parents, providers, and administrators. So the individuals in the community that we are hoping will be our end users. And there have been a number of studies done indicating that it's considered a socially valid evidence-based practice for ASD, meaning parents, providers, and administrators value this type of approach, and they believe that it's an appropriate way for teaching children with ASD. Providers have indicated that it's a desired change to their service delivery model, particularly Part C providers have indicated that they would like to see more parent-mediated interventions within their service delivery model. And in a study that was conducted a number of years ago now with parents in the state of Indiana, where they asked families of children under the age of 8, sort of what services has your child received, and then the parents were asked to rank order those services in terms of how much they felt those services contributed to their child's growth. Parents reported parent-mediated intervention or parent training as the top service that they felt had promoted their child's growth. So here we see a number of reasons to be quite positive about the use of parent-mediated intervention communities. People think that this is a good approach. Providers appreciate it, administrators think it's valuable, and families appreciate it. But what's a little bit more, I guess, concerning is that when we actually look at research on how it's being used in community settings, we see it's highly underutilized. So a study that was conducted in Part C, this has been a number of years ago now, so in 2007, looked at early intervention providers' reports of the degree to which they provide formal parent-mediated intervention. So what I mean by this is using an actual formalized parent training program as opposed to working with families kind of as things arise. And only 25% of EI providers reported doing any kind of formal parent training or parent-mediated intervention. They often talked about the involvement of families, and they very much valued family involvement. They were really much thinking about the family, which is, really important because that's heavily focused on the Part C philosophy. But, less than half of them were actually doing any kind of formal parent-mediated intervention with their clients. In another study that was conducted in North Carolina with children under the age of 4, only about 8% of parents reported having received parent-mediated intervention. And when we think about what age range this type of approach is really most appropriate for, it's really in those really young children. And if that list of parent-mediated interventions that I showed you in the previous slide, those programs were developed specifically for toddlers and preschoolers with ASDs. So the fact that there are so many programs that are available that target that specific age range, but so few families who are receiving it, suggests a really significant mismatch between what we know is best practice and what's being delivered in the community. And then in a study that one of my graduate students led several years ago that asked parents about the types of services they received and asked about the types of unmet needs that they had, parent-mediated intervention was nominated or sort of discussed in a qualitative in qualitative parts of the study as an unmet service need. And what was particularly concerning here was that families from lower socioeconomic backgrounds were much more likely to talk about parent-mediated intervention as an unmet service need. And so there appears to be not only a lack of community access in general to this approach, but this seems to be even more pronounced in families with lower socioeconomic backgrounds, suggesting additional health disparities. So we were really interested in trying to better understand what's going on in the community, particularly among families that are receiving services in publicly funded systems that are targeted for lower socioeconomic families, families with lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this research that we conducted now, just to really provide a background for how important it is to be thinking about community context when we think about parent-mediated intervention. And I'm deviating a little bit here and focusing on sort of more services research before I talk about Project ImPACT, because I think it's really important to understand and appreciate how hard sometimes it is to use these evidence-based practices in the real world. And as a researcher who develops interventions, I think it's really important for myself as well as other individuals to really get an appreciation of what currently is happening as we think about developing models to be used in those settings. So we were really interested in understanding how parent-mediated intervention is actually used in a publicly funded system. As I mentioned, there are a number of studies that have suggested parents and providers and administrators like parent-mediated intervention, but that it's underutilized. But most of the studies that have really looked at that are at least 10 years old. So we wanted to do an updated study to really examine how is parent-mediated intervention used in the community, and in particularly, given some of the health disparities we were hearing about in our qualitative work, we were particularly interested in how parent-mediated intervention was being used in the community mental health system in Michigan, because this is the primary system in the state of Michigan that provides ABA services for economically disadvantaged families. So this, if families are on Medicaid, they can receive ABA services through the CMH system in Michigan. And one of the things that's really interesting in Michigan is that So Michigan, the CMH system does actually does not. They do have a few Medicaid waivers, but it's a very small percent of the families who receive Medicaid waivers. Really, the vast majority of families who are receiving ABA services through CMH in Michigan are receiving it due to qualifying based on economic disadvantage. So we know here that this is really a group of families that tend to be typically underserved and have to a variety of services in the community, whereas in Michigan, they've developed this really excellent system that provides ABA services, and so this has been a really great place to study this. One other thing that they've done that's really excellent is they have made billing codes that allow for family training to be billed for at a slightly higher rate than behavior tech or straight ABA hours. So there's some actual financial incentives, and it's a stated goal of the ABA or the Michigan Medicaid Autism Benefit to have families receiving family training. They call it family training or parent training, parent-mediated intervention as part of their ABA services. So there's a number of systems in place that really are pushing for the use of this type of approach within this system. So we felt like, wow, there's a lot of opportunities here to really understand how is it used in a system where there's a lot of sort of top-down incentives and push for moving this into the system. Another thing is they actually have a reimbursement code for what they call family training, which allows us to be able to identify which sessions have been billed. So it lets us kind of get a different level of understanding rather than just parent or provider report, really understanding a little bit more about what is actually happening in the billing data. So we conducted a large mixed method study, and this was really led by my two graduate students, one, Deandra Straighton, who really focused on the provider end of things, and the other student, Cris Casagrande, who really focused on the parent's perspective. So I'm going to talk a little bit about their data here, but I really want to give them credit. So we actually got access, we partnered with one of the prepaid inpatient systems that basically oversees the Medicaid billing benefit, and we were able to get Medicaid claims data from 879 children with ASD who'd received services over the course of 6 months. And so these Medicaid claims data were de-identified, but we could really see what was actually being billed for. And then we also conducted an online survey with 97 providers who provided ABA services through the Michigan Medicaid service, and then 227 caregivers who received ABA services through this system. And then we conducted follow-up interviews with 13 providers and 20 caregivers. And we really were looking to try to integrate all these data together to really get a good understanding of what does parent training, relatively broadly defined, look like within this system. So when we looked at the Medicaid claims for family training encounters over the 6-month period, it was really sobering. So even though there were, state-level guidelines really pushing for the use of family training by BCBAs at least once a month, we found that 44.9% of families received no encounters over the course of 6 months, despite the fact that they received a high number of traditional face-to-face ABA encounters. So it wasn't that they weren't receiving services, it's just within the services they were receiving, they weren't receiving family training. That does mean a little over half were. However, when we looked at the families that were receiving or had reported having received at least, or when we looked at the billing data for families who had received at least one parent training encounter and looked at the intensity, what we found is over the course of 6 months, the average number of encounters received per child was 2.73, which means on average, kids are getting less than one every other month if they are receiving it at all. And when we think about those evidence-based programs that are targeting social communication skills for children with ASD, all of them were meeting at least weekly, with a few exceptions of ones that were meeting every 2 weeks. So the fact that kids are getting less than one every other month suggests that they're not getting parent-mediated intervention sessions at a level of intensity that is consistent with an evidence-based model. We saw that only 2.7% of the sample received at least 8 encounters over the course of 6 months. And again, thinking back on those evidence-based models, 8 encounters for an entire program is really consistent with one of the more lower intensity models. And if we think about some of the more higher intensity models where kids are being seen, say, 2 to 3 times per week over the course of 12 weeks or 24 weeks, we're thinking at least 20 encounters are more consistent with the higher intensity models, and not one child received 20 encounters. Suggesting that even when kids are getting family training encounters that are being billed for, whatever is happening is not consistent with the frequency we would expect in an evidence-based model. Now, we were really interested, that was billing data, and the billing data can tell you what's being billed for, but it can't really tell you what's actually happening in a session. Clearly, providers are probably doing a lot of things in session that don't quite make it all the way to the billing data. So we actually also asked providers to, on their survey, describe their use of evidence-based intervention strategies, and then we were actually particularly interested in sort of what they conceptualize family training to be. Because this term, family training, is a pretty broad term, and it, you know, when we're talking about it, we're really thinking of these evidence-based models with systematic instruction, frequent meeting, active coaching, active practice and feedback. Whereas family training actually in the literature has sometimes been used far more broadly. So we really wanted to know, when providers say they're doing family training, what do they think it is? So we asked them to do open-ended descriptions of what family training was. And what we found, we went through and we coded these data, and what we found was that most of the descriptions, or at least half of the descriptions, were really focused on the concept of psychoeducation. So there were a lot of descriptions of, I provide, education to help the parent better understand what autism is, or to help the parent better understand the Medicaid ABA benefit, or sometimes people talked about, I'm helping parents understand kind of the concepts of ABA. But they were really focused on educating parents about, not actually teaching them particular strategies. We also saw almost half of the descriptions really focused on treatment management. So things like, I check in with the parent on their child's progress, or I talk to the parent about kind of what's been going on in session. So really focused on helping connect the parent and helping the parent be involved in understanding clinical decisions that are being made, but again, not really what we think of as evidence-based parent training. And then finally, providers also described parent support strategies, things like helping the parents deal with their emotional needs, helping connect parents to important resources in the community, all of which I think are very important, but again, aren't really consistent with what we're talking about when we're talking about parent-mediated intervention. We also looked at some of the descriptions they had that were more consistent with parent-mediated intervention. And here we really focused on sort of 3 ideas that seem to be really present in all parent-mediated interventions. And those are instruction, so something about teaching the parent specific strategies, modeling, so demonstrating for the parent the specific strategies that they want them to know, and then having opportunities for the parents to practice and receive feedback. And if we really think about what's core across evidence-based parent training models, they all use some variation of this particular learning model, where there's instruction, modeling, practice, and feedback. And when we looked at the providers' descriptions, we saw that about 37% of providers provided some description of doing instruction. Only about 17% mentioned modeling in any degree, and only about 10% actually mentioned practice and feedback. And this is really kind of concerning, because when we actually look at the evidence base for parent training broadly, we find that practice and feedback is the most important element of all the adult learning strategies that promotes child growth. So if we're thinking about what are the providers doing, they're really focusing much less on some of the really key important aspects that are needed for parents to really learn the strategies. So when we looked at what percent of providers mentioned any of these three evidence-based strategies? We saw that at least 45% of providers mentioned in some way at least one of these strategies, which is great. So it means close to half of them are conceptualizing parent training in some ways similar to the evidence-based in the literature. But only 6% mentioned all three strategies. And when we really look at parent-mediated intervention models, they all contain all of these elements together. So this made us really, kind of curious about really what is actually happening in those sessions. We know they're not being implemented at a frequency consistent with evidence-based models. And when we hear providers talking about what they're doing or what they believe family training to be, they're not really describing them in ways that are consistent with strategies that are used in evidence-based models. So this makes us really start to wonder whether or not, even when people say they're doing parent training in the community, whether or not the models they're actually using are evidence-based. So we were also really interested in what makes it hard and what supports providers' use of parent training or parent-mediated intervention in the community as part of this, as part of the Michigan Medicaid autism benefit. And we identified a number of themes from the interviews that focused on barriers and facilitators. And for the most part, the barriers and the facilitators were sort of the mirror opposites. So things that providers talked about making it hard also were those same types of things that when those things were present, made things easier. So these were the kind of the themes. All of the providers mentioned logistical issues as major barriers. So some of the types of logistical issues that were described was transportation, having difficulty accessing or reaching families in the community because families lived far away, having a difficult time getting parents to participate because parents were at work during the time that the services were being offered. In terms of facilitators, people oftentimes talked about having access to things like parent manuals as being really helpful, but a lot of the issues that seem to impact providers' use of parent-mediated interventions focused on like the logistics of actually doing a program. So as an example quote, one of the providers mentioned, "I work with families that are in very rural areas, so it's difficult to get out there all the time. So getting new parent training with those families is often very difficult." Another theme that came up was issues around family engagement or interest in parent training. So almost all of the providers mentioned this was a barrier in working with some families, and many of the providers also mentioned this as a facilitator in the way that families that were very interested in participating or families that were very engaged made it easier to do parent training. But providers were very oftentimes mentioned one of the biggest hurdles they experienced was really when families weren't engaged or weren't interested in parent training. So some of our Medicaid parents view us more as a babysitter rather than something they have to actually do. So they kind of want us to fix their kid without having to actually do things. So they really viewed family engagement as a significant barrier to their ability to do family training with families. Another particular theme was that agency support or agency norms regarding parent training really influenced their use. A lot of providers felt that this was a significant barrier. So many providers mentioned that if their agency didn't really support it or really it wasn't a norm of the agency, then it was much harder to do it. So for example, I feel that my agency is probably indifferent to family training. Now remember, this is a state guideline. That people really, the state is really trying to push people to do it. So agencies that kind of embrace that were seen as facilitating, but agencies that don't really care about it, it was seen as a barrier. Another key theme that came up quite a bit was that professional training and how to provide parent training was very important. So many providers mentioned this was a significant barrier. So for example, clearly we were taught how to implement ABA therapy with children with autism, but not necessarily then how to take it and teach parents in a way that makes sense to them. So a number of providers mentioned the fact that they had not received pre-service or in-service training to prepare them to do parent training with families, made it much more difficult. And then providers that mentioned it as a facilitator often talked about the fact that they might have had a class that prepared them to do it or some additional training that they had received that made it much easier to do parent training. And then finally, Providers talked specifically about some of the family stressors and family structures that were present among many of the families that were in this Medicaid system that made it much more challenging for them to participate. So, for example, I see a lot of families that I work with, especially single parent families, where the parent has significant substance use or comorbid kind of, psychological substance use, mental health issues, those types of things. So concerns that some of the families were really difficult to be able to engage in the process because they had a number of other life stressors going on that made it much more challenging for them. So what I think is important to recognize when we think about these themes is that these are coming from the provider's perspective, but providers really are the gatekeepers in the delivery of parent training. So if they are making the decision not to offer parent training to families, it doesn't really matter whether the family would be engaged or would not be engaged because the provider is making that decision. So I think it's really important to consider sort of the issues that providers are struggling with when we think about how do we develop parent-mediated interventions that can support them in delivering these services. The other thing that I thought was really interesting and I really wanted to highlight is that providers did often mention things like family engagement or interest in parent training being a significant barrier. And that has not been the experience that we have necessarily had with families in our own work. And when we look at the literature, we actually see families, even families that are experiencing a number of stressors, report how much they want to be engaged in intervention with their children. So we were really curious, particularly in this area, what things influence families' engagement and interest in participating in parent training. And are the providers' sort of perceptions in this area accurate, or might they be sort of misinterpreting families' perceptions of the value of parent training? So we also did an evaluation with families, and this is part of a much larger project that we're still kind of putting some of the data together. But I just wanted to highlight a few things from the parent side, and again, this was led by my student, Carice Casagrande. And so she did a survey with over 200 families who were receiving services through the Medicaid benefit. And there were a number of things she looked at, but one thing was asking them to what extent they had been offered family training. So again, thinking about that role of providers being the gatekeepers, all families were supposed to be offered parent training as part of their enrollment in services. So we were really interested in, sort of had parents actually known that they were being offered this. And we found that most families had actually said that they had some access to parent training. So about 38% of the families said yes, that they actually currently are receiving family training in some form. Again, this is a broad definition of family training. We didn't tell them what that involved, but are you getting family training? 38% said, yep, we are. 24% said we did in the past, but we're not currently. And that does make sense because we see families who are sometimes involved in these services for a long period of time where they might have already learned the skills and had no more need for additional family training after a certain period. We had 3% that didn't respond. We also had a small number of parents that had been offered parent training but decided that they didn't want to participate. But then we had 25% of families that said, nope, I have never been offered family training. So that suggests that, we have providers that are really actually not offering this to families. And some of that may be due to providers feeling like they are trying to be sensitive to the family's needs. So some of the things that came up in our qualitative interviews with providers was that, particularly when the family had significant stressors or significant challenges in terms of other things, housing insecurity, food insecurity. Sometimes providers were not offering family training to them sort of in a protective way, thinking this is one additional thing that they can't take on or can't handle. But again, they're serving in that gatekeeping role, and it's not always clear that that is really in the family's best interest. So of those families that were reporting that they were currently receiving, we also asked, okay, so how often are you actually meeting with your provider and doing family training? Just getting a different idea of sort of what's happening. And 40% reported meeting with their provider weekly or biweekly. And so this was actually quite positive. We were thinking, you know, from the billing data, we were really concerned that families just weren't meeting at all. But about 40% who said they were receiving parent training currently, so 40% of that 38% said that they were meeting weekly or bi-weekly to do some form of family training. But only about half of that group reported meeting with their provider for more than 30 minutes. So again, when we go back to looking at those evidence-based parent-mediated intervention models, sessions are typically an hour at minimum. And so it's really curious, can providers really be doing those evidence-based strategies when they're meeting with families every other week for 10 minutes? Or are they doing other things more consistent with sort of treatment management or basic psychoed that really aren't the key to evidence-based practice? We also asked providers, parents to talk about the degree to which they were currently involved in their child's services, broadly defined, and to what extent they would like to have the same level of involvement that they currently had, less involvement, or more involvement. And over half of the families said that they would like to be either somewhat or a lot more involved in their child's ABA services. So these are families saying, I would really like to participate more than I currently am, suggesting that the providers' perceptions that families really aren't interested in participating may not be fully accurate. We also knew that based on the provider descriptions of family training, that when we asked parents about getting family training, they might not actually have been exposed to what we think of evidence-based family training. They might have been told it's family training, but it may not actually look like our conceptualizations of evidence-based practices. So after we asked them about what they were currently receiving, we then gave them a flyer to help orient them to the type of family training we were really thinking about. And so we talked about the 7 key strategies that really seem to be evident in evidence-based models, and that's collaboration with the provider to develop goals, modeling, you know, showing the parent what to do, practicing the strategies with the child, and receiving feedback from the provider as they're practicing or after they practiced, to do some active planning for how the parent's going to carry out those strategies at home between sessions, engaging in active problem solving with the provider for how to help them adjust their use of the strategies, and then some kind of handout or written information to help the parents review the material offline. So we gave them this flyer and then said, okay, now we actually have some questions for you about your interest in participating in this kind of program, and asked them more detailed questions about this type of program. And what we found was parents reported a high motivation to participate in evidence-based parent training. Parent motivation for this treatment was rated as a mean of 4.26 on a 5-point scale on the parent motivation inventory, suggesting that parents really value this type of programming. We also saw that we also then asked parents to rate their use or their receipt of this type of intervention. So to what degree does your provider use each of these strategies with you when they are doing parent training or family training? And then what we found was overall satisfaction with their child's ABA programming was related to the degree to which parents said that their providers use these evidence-based strategies with them when they were doing parent training, suggesting that it's not just about parents wanting saying that this would be a helpful thing to try, but that actually the parents who are receiving more of this were actually overall much more satisfied with the services that their child was receiving. Then we interviewed the families to really get a better understanding of what their experience with parent training or family training was within the system. And a pretty significant theme was the current sessions, when they're getting family training, typically are only progress monitoring. So the provider is coming in and talking about what happened in session, but they're not actively teaching the parent anything. So for example, they had talked about parent training, and essentially when I've gone to these things, it's more review of the progress my son is making, and there's no real training going on. So again, this is pretty consistent with what we heard providers saying when they talked about what they thought of parent training being. Parents also mentioned that they valued hands-on training, particularly when they received it, and they really appreciated visuals to support learning. So things like handouts, manuals, pictures, refrigerator reminders, So I think having an actual example, like hands-on, and having them watch me and tell me, you know, where to improve or what areas I'm lacking in, I think that would be very helpful. So here the parent is describing actually parent-mediated intervention as we think about it in terms of evidence-based practice. So this parent was suggesting that if they got that, that would be very helpful, but they really weren't receiving that. They also talked about that they would really attend a weekly session focused on this if the evidence-based model of parent training was offered. So for something like that, I wouldn't have minded an hour a week. I wouldn't have minded once a week for an hour each time. That's the way I thought it was going to be. But then it wasn't. I was just like, okay, you know, this is ridiculous. This is a waste of time. So when we start putting all this together, we're starting to see providers are thinking parents aren't really motivated to participate. But it could very well be that what providers are offering to parents aren't really of value to parents. What parents really want isn't what's being offered. And so you could imagine if the parent isn't getting something that they value and they want to participate in, they might seem less motivated to participate. And so that could be part of the breakdown. And then finally, another thing that came up quite often was parents talked about turnover in staff or a significant challenge, and challenges communicating with providers in the text. So oftentimes they mention things about the relationship with texts and the turnover and relationship with their providers as impacting their ability to be engaged in their child's programming. So I spent a lot of time really thinking about and talking about where are we in community services before I talk about Project ImPACT, because I think it's so important to really understand why we really need to be thinking about evidence-based models and moving evidence-based models into the community. I think the take-home message of this work has really been that there is really limited access to what we think about as evidence-based parent-mediated interventions in the CMH setting within the state of Michigan. Having worked in a lot of other settings as well, I would imagine a lot of these findings, although they were limited to the ABA benefit as part of Medicaid services in Michigan, my guess is these findings are not unique to this particular system. That these findings are probably relatively generalizable to a lot of publicly funded systems. We also found that the quality of parent-mediated intervention is likely low if we just go on the basics of frequency, what strategies providers suggest they're using, what strategies parents suggest they're receiving, with really limited use of those key coaching strategies. So people might say they're getting parent training, but they may not really be getting evidence-based parent training or parent-mediated intervention. We also saw that there are significant barriers at the family level, the provider level, and the organizational level that all influence providers' use of these strategies with families and families' ability to participate. So when we really think about developing parent-mediated interventions for families that are to be delivered in community settings, it's incredibly important that we consider community needs and the systems in which we're expecting these interventions to go, and make sure that we're providing supports that can really help providers and families participate, that can surmount some of these barriers that they're likely to experience in community settings. So given that parent-mediated intervention is underutilized in community settings, we've been really focused on thinking about ways that we can increase community use. And we've done this through sort of two different interrelated approaches. The first has really been thinking about how we might be able to improve implementation of parent-mediated intervention within existing systems. So thinking about targeting things like community mental health, Part C, early childhood special education, and really helping to develop materials and models that actually fit within those systems in which most children receive services. And this may mean thinking a little bit differently about the intervention, development, and testing process to make sure that the ultimate models that we're developing for providers to use actually match the settings in which they're being used. The other approach we've taken has been thinking a little bit more about ways we might be able to modify systems of care or create new systems of care that allow access to parent-mediated interventions for families that have difficulty accessing it through traditional systems. And for this, we've really been thinking about developing alternative delivery models, and where this has really focused has been on the use of telehealth to deliver parent-mediated intervention. Ultimately, this work together has led to the development of Project ImPACT. And Project ImPACT is a parent-mediated intervention that was developed specifically to help providers deliver this type of intervention in community settings. And when I'm going to provide a very brief overview conceptually of what Project ImPACT is, and then we're going to talk a little bit more details about the specific intervention, the coaching model, and then talk a little bit about how we are working to help providers use this model in their settings. So Project ImPACT is a parent-mediated intervention that was developed based on best practices in parent-mediated intervention for young children with ASD. And what that means is that it targets core deficits in social communication skills. So when we look at research on social communication development in young children with ASD, we see specific areas of challenge around social engagement, communication, imitation, and play. And so we have developed this intervention to specifically focus on these areas to build these skills in children. We also use evidence-based intervention strategies, and the intervention itself is consistent with the naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention approach, or NDBI, and it actually shares a number of strategies with other NDBI programs, similar to the list that I mentioned a little bit earlier. I'm going to break down these specific intervention techniques in a few minutes, but needless to say, we have a set of intervention techniques that are based on this a developmental framework and that incorporate ABA strategies in order to teach new skills. And then we also have included effective parent coaching and engagement strategies. These are really designed to help families actively engage with the intervention, as well as strategies based on adult learning to help parents learn the new skills. And that includes parent-selected goals, the sequence, systematic instruction, practice and feedback, and ongoing support and problem solving. So a number of these aspects are shared by other NDBI parent-mediated interventions. What we really think makes Project ImPACT unique is that our idea was to take what we know about best practices, but then make sure that it fits well within community settings. So we've combined this with elements that were designed to support community use. And to do this, we worked with parents and providers receiving and delivering services in community settings, as well as administrators, to really identify what are the key pieces that are needed in a program to allow providers to use it effectively with families. And so one aspect was to really make sure that the strategies that we were selecting from what we know about best practices were really compatible with families' daily lives, so that we really made a heavy emphasis on helping parents use these strategies in play, like many other NDBIs, but also throughout their daily routines that they do with their child on a daily basis. We also wanted to make sure that the techniques were really easy to learn, and so we did a lot of different iterations of thinking about which techniques to include and how to sequence them so that parents could learn them in a sequenced way that would be very easy to master. We also found from providers that one of the key aspects that was a barrier was the lack of quality technical supports or manuals or videos to support their delivery of the program. So we also included a lot of technical supports. We have a parent manual, we have a coach manual. The coach manual has session by session information about what to teach in each session. It has a lot of strategies for how to teach things, problem solving when particular challenges come up, as well as PowerPoint presentations that providers can use if they're delivering the training in a group. We have lots of video examples that are available for both the parents and the providers to learn the strategies, and handouts that providers can use to help support parent learning. So we found that this was very key for providers to feel comfortable using parent-mediated intervention with families. And then finally, one of the key things that came up in our work as we were developing this project is that community settings often differ in their delivery models. So Some programs are designed to be, most services are done in a one-to-one format with a provider going into the family home. That's often seen in Part C programs. But we also see programs where parents are bringing their child to a clinic or to a classroom. And providers who are delivering services in a classroom-based model have very different needs in terms of program structure than providers that are delivering one-to-one services in the family home or in a clinic. So we really worked on making sure that the delivery model, how the program is actually delivered to parents, could fit within a variety of different settings. So I thought I would start, before I actually break down Project ImPACT and start talking a little bit more about the intervention techniques and the coaching model, with just to orient everyone what we're actually talking about. So this is a video example. This is actually a video from some of our professional materials of what Project ImPACT looks like in action. And this is an example of a mother and her daughter before she participated in Project ImPACT and then after she had participated in Project ImPACT. And so what you'll be able to see in this video example is sort of what sorts of changes we would expect in that interaction when a parent has gone through the program. So you'll see the parent using some of the Project ImPACT strategies specifically, and we'll break that down and talk about what those strategies are in more detail in a moment. But you can also see sort of how the use of those strategies influences the way that the parent engages with her child.
Open. Open. Push, push, push. Yeah. Push my heart. What should we do? Open it. Baby monkey. Oh, does baby monkey need a blanket or a bottle? Okay. My monkey's hungry too. No babies. Oh, a real baby. Oh, she needs to go to sleep. Yes, the baby is very tired. Good night, baby. Good night. Oh, yeah, baby is hungry. Oh, that's better. Baby's happy now. Good job, baby. Is you a baby? No, monkey's the baby. When, I'm so hungry. When, I'm so hungry. Yeah. Oh, thank you. I'm so hungry.
So hopefully you can see in that video clip that there was a change in the way in which the parent and the child interacted. The second interaction involved much more social communication. There was much more positive affect. They were much more socially involved with each other. The child was using more initiations and more sophisticated language. And you notice that the mother was using several of the intervention techniques that we'll talk about in her interactions. It really helped the child participate more fully in that interaction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the individual components of Project ImPACT. And that includes both the intervention and the parent coaching model. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about the provider training model. As I talk about what each of these components are, I'm going to talk a little bit about the techniques as well as some of the research that we've conducted looking at those components. Overall, I will say that the entire package is considered an evidence-based practice by the National Standards Project and the recent report released by the NCAEP. So I'm going to begin by talking about the intervention strategies. And as I mentioned before, Project ImPACT is an NDBI, which means it shares a lot of intervention techniques or strategies with other NDBIs. So as I provide a brief overview of these intervention strategies, I'm imagining those of you who are familiar with other NDBIs will see a lot of similarities. When we teach these intervention strategies to parents, we use a lot of visuals and a lot of mnemonics to really try to help them put them together. So I'm going to talk to you about the intervention techniques somewhat in the way we talk to parents, which is thinking about the Project ImPACT facts. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about the Project ImPACT components, and that includes the intervention itself, the techniques that we teach parents to use with their children, as well as the parent coaching model, or the different approaches we take to teaching parents. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the provider training model, which is the model we use for teaching community providers to implement this program with parents. And as I talk about each of these components, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research we've conducted on each of these components to better understand how they're working. And then I will just begin with saying that the overall program is considered an evidence-based practice by the National Standards Project and the recent report by the NCAEP, which really looks at it as an overall program. And I'll talk about its individual components. So as I begin, I wanted to talk a little bit about the intervention strategies. Now, Project ImPACT is an NDBI, and so those of you who are familiar with other NDBIs will likely notice a lot of similarities in the individual techniques that we use. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the techniques from the perspective of the second edition of the program, which really organizes the Project ImPACT intervention techniques into 6 overarching Project ImPACT strategies. And we do this, we talk about the Project ImPACT facts, or the Project ImPACT facts pyramid, to really help parents think about how these individual techniques and strategies work together to help their child learn social communication. And we teach the strategies at the bottom of the pyramid first. Those are focused on your child and adjust your communication. And we think of these strategies as being really the base of all the NDBI interventions. And they're really designed to help the child engage with the adult and the activity. So by focusing on the child and adjusting one's communication, you can really follow into the child's lead and actively engage them in the interaction. We then teach the strategies at the middle of the pyramid, create opportunities, and these strategies are designed to help the child initiate communication or play with the adult. So the way we talk about it is that oftentimes those strategies at the bottom are really great to set the stage for interaction, but for some children with autism or other social communication challenges, they might not be quite enough to help the child be able to move to the role of being an initiator. So the strategies at the middle of the pyramid are really designed to help that child initiate. And then the strategies at the top of the pyramid, teach new skills, use prompting and reinforcement, so ABA strategies within a naturalistic context to help the child communicate or play in new or more complex ways. So we're really teaching the child new skills outside of their current repertoire. And then the last strategy, shape the interaction, is really designed to help the parents balance the use of their strategies across the different elements of levels of the pyramid to help the child stay engaged. So using those strategies at the bottom of the pyramid while also learning new skills. So I can just talk a little bit about what these individual strategies involve. So the first strategy is focus on your child, and this strategy, again, is really designed to be the beginning of building engagement with a child. And in this overarching strategy, we teach the parent 2 specific techniques. One is follow your child's lead, which involves getting face-to-face with the child, following into the child's choice of materials and way to play, adding to the child's interaction, and responding to the child's communication. And then we also teach the parent to imitate their child's actions with objects, body movements, sounds, etc. And really, these strategies are designed to help the child fully engage in the activity and really try to begin to build that relationship with the parent or play partner. The other strategy at the bottom of the pyramid is adjust your communication. And these techniques involve use animation, which is to increase or use heightened animation to really emphasize the nonverbal elements of communication. So using larger gestures, larger facial expressions, but also adjusting your animation to ensure that the child stays regulated. So if the child's getting overwhelmed, we teach the parent to reduce their animation a little to kind of help them regulate. And then we also teach the parent to model and expand communication. So these are using simple language around the child's focus of attention. Being repetitive, making sure that you're modeling comments rather than asking questions, and then expanding on the child's communication. So when the child communicates, adding an element of information beyond that. So when we put it together, what it might look like in practice can be shown by this sequence graphic that we use as a teaching tool. So, in terms of the focus on the adjust elements, focusing on the child and adjusting communication, if we have a child who maybe is in the bathtub playing with her mother, and she's playing with cups and water, what the mother might do to be able to focus and adjust on her child's play is to get face-to-face with her daughter down at the tub, so getting down on her knees, getting close, imitating, pouring the child, if the child's pouring water from one cup to another, imitating that, and then using really simple language to talk about what they're doing. So the mom might model cup, or pour, or water. And what the parent is going to do is she's going to then wait and look for any response. And when we're teaching strategies at the bottom of the pyramid, we're really teaching the parents to look for any response from the child. That could be verbal, it could be nonverbal, it could be moving away or towards the parent. So in this case, the little girl looks at her mother, and her mother takes that as a communication and responds appropriately by continuing to imitate her actions, and then expands on that look by modeling the word pour, because she's interpreting the looking at mom, that she likes that her mom's pouring the water, and she's going to continue. So then we teach the strategies at the middle of the pyramid, and these create opportunity strategies are, the specific techniques are playful obstruction, which involves playfully interrupting the child's play. And we might suggest that the parent maybe block the child's play with a puppet, or if the child is pushing a car back and forth, they might use another car to block the child's play in a playful way, trying to bring it into the play activity. And what this does is it creates an opportunity for the child to communicate with their parent to be able to continue the activity. We also teach balanced turns, which involves taking turns with the child, where the parent will take a turn with the child's play material, which provides an opportunity for the child to need to request a turn to get the activity back, or the play materials back. And then finally, we teach a set of communicative temptations, which involve a number of different ways the parent can set up opportunities in daily routines to create opportunities for the child to initiate, such as playing with materials that require the parent's assistance, or using small portions, where rather than giving the child an entire snack, they might give the child just a few elements or a few items and wait for the child to initiate for more. So these strategies all work very well to help the child initiate if they're not doing so when the parent is using the strategies at the bottom of the pyramid. So what that might look like in practice in the same example, where little girl's in the tub with her mother, is her mother starts again with focusing and adjusting, gets face to face, imitates pouring water, uses simple language, cup, pour water, but her daughter doesn't really acknowledge her involvement in the activity. So what she might do then is she might take a turn. So she's going to take a turn with Sarah's cup and then hold it up. Now this has created an opportunity for Sarah to initiate in some way. Her mom waits and looks for any response. And in this situation, now her daughter's reaching for the cup. So that's a slightly more complex initiation. And the mom responds appropriately to that by giving Sarah the cup, pointing to it and saying cup. So then she expands on the child's communication and models an action and word that the child could use. Next, we teach the parents teach new skills, which are based on prompting and reinforcement. We use the term prompts and rewards in the second edition. But we teach the parents how to use prompts and rewards to teach the child to use new or more complex skills than they are using on their own. And so we teach a set of prompts to teach the child to use communication, to understand communication and follow directions, to teach the child to specifically imitate the play behavior of the parent, and then a set of prompts to help the parent expand the child's play into more complex play actions. So each of these sets of techniques are really, prompts and rewards are used together to target different social communication skills. And what that might look like in this example would be mother again is focusing on her child. In the bathtub, she creates that opportunity by taking a turn with Sarah's cup and holding it up, and she's looking for any response. Child reaches for the cup, but now instead of simply handing the daughter the cup and responding to her, now the parent is going to prompt the child to do something slightly more complex, something the child isn't able to do yet on their own or isn't doing spontaneously. So in this case, the mom might prompt the child to ideally say the word cup, but if not, point to the cup, both of which are more complex than a reach. So we teach the parents to use generally 3 prompts to try to help the child be successful, starting with the least supportive prompt and adding support as necessary. So the mom may start by pointing to the cup and saying cup and waits for Sarah to respond. If Sarah doesn't point or say cup, she might present that same prompt again by pointing to the cup and saying cup. And if Sarah still doesn't respond, the mom will add support by using physical guidance and helping Sarah point to the cup. Sarah will, of course, then point to the cup because her mother's physically guiding her to do this. And now her mom is going to reward and expand on that. So she's going to give Sarah the cup to reward it, point to it, and say cup. So this is the way these types of strategies build on each other so that you can imagine, in some cases, the parent is simply going to respond to what the child is doing. And in some cases, the parent is going to prompt for a slightly more complex response. The last strategy is shape the interaction. And this is really designed to make sure that the child is staying actively engaged in the activity and the interaction with the parent while also challenging them enough to learn new skills. So we teach the parent to move up and down the pyramid using different levels of techniques and different levels of support to help keep that child engaged and learning. So we teach them that they should spend most of the time at the bottom of the pyramid to help the child engage. But if the child hasn't initiated after 30 seconds or so, then they might want to move up to create an opportunity. So they might use that about 2/3 of the time to really help that child initiate or to gain the child's attention. And then about 1/3 of the time, the parent might try to teach new skills. So here the parent might prompt for a more complex response than the child is using on their own. And then by shaping the interaction, by moving up and down the pyramid, the parent can keep the child actively learning while also keeping them actively engaged. So I thought I would talk a little bit about the research that we have conducted on the intervention itself. So the intervention techniques share a lot in common with other NBBIs and already had an evidence base to some degree individually. But when we developed the Project ImPACT intervention, we kind of put the strategies together in a unique way. So we wanted to make sure that the way in which we put those techniques together, those strategies together, were still effective for increasing social communication skills. So we conducted some work testing the impact of this intervention when it was implemented directly by trained clinicians. So how does the intervention work when clinicians are using it with children? And we did this with 2 single case design studies across 14 different children. The first study was really designed to try to understand how the different components are related to child language growth. So we did a component analysis of some of the language teaching strategies. So that involved that modeling and expanding communication, as well as the prompting and rewarding of language. So we did a component analysis where we alternated treatments to 5 children, where some children, where each child was exposed to some sessions where the clinician was using only the bottom of the pyramid strategies, and sometimes only using the top of the pyramid strategies, and sometimes combining them together to see sort of what of those elements were most associated with language gains in the child. And then we also did another study looking at the intervention overall and the degree to which it improved social engagement, language, and play skills. And then in that single case design, some of the children received language and play targeted together within a session, and some of the children received language targeted for 30 minutes and then play targeted for 30 minutes. So we were interested in seeing how that worked together. Does the intervention overall increase child's social communication, as well as does it matter whether we are targeting all of the skills together or whether we should focus individually on one at a time? So our findings provided evidence that the intervention is effective for increasing language and social engagement. So our study that looked at Project ImPACT being implemented fully showed improvements in these areas. And we also saw that, particularly in the component analysis, where we were looking at the use of the different strategy sets, prompting was definitely necessary for increasing child communication. So that would be those teach new skills strategies. Prompting and reinforcement for teaching communication really seemed to be the most effective strategy for getting children to actually produce new communication outside their repertoire. At the same time, there did seem to be a slight advantage of the combined intervention for some children, suggesting that some of the kids actually did better when we put modeling and expanding language together with prompts and rewards. So that provides some evidence that the collection of these strategies together do seem to work well. We also looked at whether or not teaching language and play at the same time led to similar gains. And what we found is it doesn't really matter for teaching language. So when language and play were targeted together or separately, children seem to learn and use language similar in both cases. However, play didn't seem to work as well when it was targeted alongside language. The children where we targeted play for 30 minutes separately from language seemed to make greater gains in their play skills. And we had a number of hypotheses for why this might be. It may just be that it's more difficult for the child to focus on more than one skill at a time, and play may be a little bit more challenging for them to learn than communication. But this allows us to make some recommendations for how parents might practice these strategies, whether they want to be targeting both together or separately. So this is an example of a little guy who participated in one of these studies. And this was over the course of about 12 weeks. When he started, you'll see that he was really pre-verbal. He wasn't really communicating using any kind of consistent word approximations, and even his sounds were pretty limited. And then you can see over the course of this relatively short, low-intensity intervention that he made significant improvements in his communication and social engagement. And I should just mention that in this study, we were really looking at the evidence base for this intervention as delivered at a very low intensity. So children were getting just 2 hours a week of this intervention from clinicians as part of the study.
Bunnies. There's bears. You like the bunnies. Bunny ears. Feet. Feet. There's balls and sticks over here. Sticks. Ball. Yeah, sticks. Go take it down. Good job. You put it up. Down. We put it up. Up. You say it. Okay. Up. Up. Okay, your turn. We're gonna put it up. There you go. Up. Good job. Up. Oh, over here. Over here. Now relax. Relax. Open. Open. You do it. Open. Great. Open, Nikki. Open. Good job. Nice pointing. Open, relax. Open, relax. Jump out. Jump. Jump. Out. Here they come. Out. Relax. Orange and green. Come out. It's empty. It's all out. It's a bag. Bag. Oh, zip. Zip. Close it. You want to close it. Relax. Relax. Stack. Relax. Up. Whoa! Shake. Relax. Stop. Relax. Do it. Relax. Good job. Relax. Nice job. Relax. Turn it around. Around. Turn around. On. Push. Turn around. You put it on. Up. Good. Nice job. Look how tall. Turn around. It's so tall. What should we do? Oh, one more. Turn. Let's turn. On. Open. Open. Good job. Open. Marbles. Marbles. Oh, so many. You like a lot of marbles. Ready, set, go. 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 Put it all down. Oh, let's do this way. It's wrong. Here. We'll just do it. Put it right here. Right on. Marbles. 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 Down, down, down. We do more. More. Good job. More marbles. More. Down, down, down. Down, down, down. We caught them all. Marbles. In. Oh, stop. Should we play go? Go. Go. Go, Lion, go. Go, marbles, go. Go, go, go. Look, look. Yay. Yay. Oh, those are fun. Oh, put that one away. Okay. Marbles. Do more. Good job. More marbles. More marbles. In. Down, 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 down. Yay! There's so many. There's so many. Down, 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 down. Down, down, down. Up, drop. Ready, set. Go. Good job. Go, marbles. Uh-oh. Push. Good asking. Open. Open fish. Fish and swim. Big fish. Duck. Cheese. Red. Red fish. Oh, that one's a seahorse. Fish. Fish. I'm gonna catch one. Caught it. Red. I'm gonna catch one. I caught it. Fish. Blue fish. I'm gonna catch one, Tony. Fish. You caught one. Good work. Yellow fish. Fish. Mimi. Oh, she's watching. Fish. Yellow.
So hopefully in this video example, you can see a number of the different intervention techniques at work. Clearly following the child's lead, doing some imitation of the child, creating opportunities by taking turns, holding back objects, and then some direct prompting and rewards or prompting and reinforcement of specific types of communication, as well as play skills. And you can also see over the course of this low intensity intervention over about 12 weeks, this child moved from being really pre-verbal into sort of the single word stage of communication. And just because I think it's really cute, I'm going to show you another example of this little guy a few months later, actually. This is a therapist using the strategies in his home. So you can see what some of these intervention techniques might look like during a daily routine.
Okay. What should we use first? Should we get soap or water? Use water. Okay. Water on our hands. Now what do we need? Okay. Soap on my hands too. Yeah, I'll turn it down. Oh, there we go. Okay, let's wash our hands. Wash, wash, wash. Nice job. Wash your back, Tony. Exit your hand. Wash, wash, wash. Nice job, this person. Wash, wash, wash. The other hand. Wash, wash, wash. This. Wash, wash, wash. Wash, wash, wash. Okay. Rinse off the water. Or wash off the soap. We're not there yet. Take all the soap off. What should we do now? Should we turn water off or use towel? Okay. Dry your hands. Now what should we do? Turn off water. Nice job. Okay. Now we're ready for a snack.
So you can see this in this example, a number of those same intervention strategies, but embedded in a daily routine. And when we talk about teaching families these strategies, we really emphasize the importance of using the intervention techniques during play, because that's a really highly motivating context in which children use social communication and learn from their families, but also emphasize using these strategies throughout the day in daily routines that the parents are doing with their child anyway. So now I'm going to switch over to talk a little bit about the coaching models that we use in Project ImPACT. And what we have is actually 2 official coaching models and a 3rd coaching model that we've been using in our research, and that lately with the current pandemic, we've actually been working with a lot of community providers to use. So the first is our individual coaching model. And this model is designed to be conducted in a situation where the provider works one-to-one with the family. So the individual coaching model, typically the parent is meeting with the coach and the child. And this can be done either in the home or it can be done in a clinic setting. And the provider teaches the parents the intervention strategies and has opportunities for practice and feedback throughout a one-on-one session, which is usually somewhere between about 60 to 90 minutes. In the original model, we developed the program to be conducted twice a week for 12 weeks, so 24 individual coaching sessions. We have actually done some research, which I'll talk about in a moment, showing that you can actually modify the coaching model so that it can be conducted once a week for 12 weeks. So this works better for some programs where they don't have the intensity, where they can't see the parent twice a week. And again, the coaching sessions are designed to be the primary area where the parent is learning the strategies as well as practicing and receiving feedback with their child. We found that this was a really appropriate coaching model for programs where they're seeing the child individually. However, a lot of the programs that serve children ages 3 and up are actually designed to see the child in a classroom-based setting. And so we started working with classrooms, early childhood special education classrooms, and we showed them the individual coaching model. And they said, that's great, but we can't meet individually with families twice a week, every week. We have an entire classroom of children. So what we tried to do is think about how can we adapt that model so that we can capitalize on the fact that families are really being seen in groups and try to still keep in what we think are really important for learning. So what we did with the group coaching model is it was, again, designed to be 12 weeks, but the didactic piece where the coach is teaching the parent what the intervention techniques look like and how to actually use them are now being taught in a group setting with PowerPoint slides and video examples. And then the parents get sessions to practice directly with their child and receive feedback, but there are fewer sessions. So the group coaching model is designed to be 12 weeks with 12 2-hour group sessions where parents come together and learn the strategies together. And then each family gets 6 individual coaching sessions that alternate with the group sessions, where they get to practice with their child and receive feedback from a coach. So it still has that important element of coaching in it, but some of the didactic pieces can be done more effectively in group. And some of the nice things about the group model that we didn't fully anticipate when we first developed it is that parents develop greater sense of social support from the other parents. And so we actually have a lot of families that have expressed a real benefit of the group has been meeting and learning from other parents. So although we were originally thinking the group model, families would come together as a group simply as a way of increasing the efficiency of the didactic portion, we think that there's actually some therapeutic aspects of the group itself where parents really get to learn and interact with other parents. And then finally, we have a telehealth coaching model that is not fully represented in our coaching manual. However, as I'll talk about in a moment, most of the individual coaching strategies can be delivered through telehealth just fine. So our telehealth coaching model that we use in our research is actually twice a week for 30 minutes each time. And in the first 30-minute session of the week, the parent reviews an online tutorial that they do on their own with the coach, and the coach really helps them understand the intervention techniques, sort of the didactic portion. And then the second coaching session in the week, which is only about 30 minutes, the parent is practicing with their child and receiving feedback over Zoom. In terms of all of these models, although they all are structured slightly differently, they all keep what we think of as sort of the core elements of effective coaching. So they all involve collaborative goal setting. They all involve systematic instruction, so the techniques are taught in a systematic way. They build on each other. They use real-world examples. They use video examples to teach. They all involve parent practice and feedback, although the way in which parents practice and receive feedback might differ. So in an individual coaching model, it's going to be live, but with a telehealth coaching model, the practice and feedback is going to be done synchronously, but over Zoom. And then they all involve ongoing support and problem solving. So I thought what I would do is sort of talk about those key elements that we think are as important in the Project ImPACT coaching process that are shared across all the models. The process for developing goals collaboratively with the parents first involves providing a description of social communication development. And this is really designed to help the parent understand how these social skills develop in children, as well as where their child's current skills are at. So the provider talks the parents through sort of typical process of development in the areas of social engagement, in the areas of communication, imitation, and play. And then the parent and the provider work together to gather information on the child's skills. And this is done by having the parent complete a social communication checklist, which basically lists a lot of this skills in the areas of social engagement, communication, imitation, and play in a developmental order. And the parents fill that out to determine sort of where their child's current skills are, while the provider plays with the child and gets a feel for what the child's skills are when the coach uses various Project ImPACT strategies. But then the provider observes the parent while the parent plays with their child, and then the provider can really see how the child is able to use their current skills with the parent. And then they work together to compare their social communication checklists to understand sort of where the child's skills are, both with and without support. And then finally, the parent and the provider work together to set goals collaboratively. And what we see with this process is we are able to increase parents' excitement about the program and empowerment and active involvement in the program because they've been very heavily involved with the process of developing goals for their child. And so that means the goals that are developed are ones that the parent really cares about. And so that can really encourage active engagement and buy-in. So then we think about coaching. And when we are thinking about the coaching elements, our goals of coaching are to teach the parent new ways to interact with their child, to recognize the parent's strength and effort, to provide an opportunity for the parents to practice and receive feedback from the coach, to jointly identify and problem solve behaviors, and increase the parents' independence during daily activities. So when we talk about the coaching process, regardless of the coaching model we're using, we have the same general process, and this doesn't really change much depending on, regardless of whether we are doing the individual model, the group model, or the telehealth model. Sort of when this occurs in the program might look a little differently, but when we're coaching, and how much time we spend on each of these pieces differs a little bit as to whether you are in the individual program or the group program. But across all of them, we have the same general process for coaching. The session typically starts with a checking in and setting the session agenda. So the provider wants to get an idea of sort of what has happened since the last time they saw. This allows an opportunity if some kind of particular concern has arisen, the parent has an opportunity to bring that up, and the coach can rearrange the session agenda as needed. But then the coach really expresses what the plan for the day is going to be. So they talk about what is particular strategy the parent's going to learn that day, what is the goal of the strategy, what the session's going to look like. You know, the provider might say, I'm going to model this activity, and then we need you time to practice. And we're going to end with an opportunity for you to develop a plan so that the parent knows going into the session what they're expected to do, what they're planning to learn, and how they're going to be involved in the intervention. We found that this setting the session agenda is very important for getting families ready to participate in actively in the session. The next element is the provider works with the parent to review the practice plan from the previous week, which I'll talk a little bit more about towards the when we talk about what the practice plan is at the end of the session. But here, the provider checks in and asks the parent how their practice went, and asks the parent to discuss sort of what was hard about using the strategy over the previous week and what went well. And then they engage in active problem solving. Then the provider introduces the new technique, and we typically do introduce a new technique every session so that the parent is actively learning something new every time. But many times these intervention techniques build on previous ones, so in some cases you're not always although you're introducing new techniques every time, these techniques actually work together as a strategy, so it's not overwhelming in terms of the amount of information parents are learning. So when then the next step is the provider introduces the new technique. And Project ImPACT has a variety of techniques that fit into those overall strategies that I talked about. So each session, the provider is typically introducing one or two techniques. And when they do that, the provider uses program materials to introduce the technique. So we have a parent manual, we use a lot of visuals, and we explain the rationale. Why is the parent going to use this strategy? What actual skills does it target in the child? And then they discuss the key elements of the strategy. And as they do that, they ask the parent a variety of questions that are embedded in the program to help them really apply that information to their own child. And then finally, they end with explaining the steps using the sequence graphic, like that example I showed you when we were talking about the intervention techniques. After the provider introduces the new technique, then they demonstrate the technique. And when this is being done in an individual coaching program, the provider demonstrates directly with the child. Before they do that, they always prepare the parent for the demonstration. So they say, you know, now I'm going to play with your child. I want you to watch for the technique we just talked about, watch for how I'm using it and how your child's responding. When the provider is using the group model or the individual telehealth coaching model, they can't actually demonstrate live with the child. So in those cases, the provider demonstrates the technique using pre-developed video examples that we have in the program. And so they would similarly provide a demonstration, and they would similarly prepare the parent for the demonstration by saying, look for the techniques the parent in this video is using and how the child responds. And then after the demonstration period, the provider helps the parent reflect on what they observed to really clarify any additional questions the parent might have about the technique. Then the parent is asked to practice the new techniques with their child while they receive feedback from the coach. And the parent practice and feedback really is the bulk of the coaching session. So although we do demonstrate the strategy live if we're doing individual coaching, really that's only a very small percentage of the session. Most of the session is spent really with the parent practicing and getting that feedback. While the parent is practicing, the coach is, if they're able to be present, managing the physical environment, but then they're also providing feedback. And when they are providing feedback, they're focusing both on positive feedback to really help the parent understand what they're doing correctly, and corrective feedback to give some suggestions for how the parent might be able to change their interaction slightly to help the strategy be more successful. And although we do this primarily live, both when we're doing coaching in person as well as when we're doing telehealth, we're getting feedback live. There are various points in the program where we do coaching off of videotape, where the parent might videotape an interaction with their child, or the coach might videotape the parent interacting with their child, and then reviewing the interaction together and having the parent discuss the interaction in more detail. Then at the end of the practice period, the parent then reflects with the coach and they plan for practice. So the coach asks the parent to think about what they felt went well, and then helps the parent think about specific goals that they've selected that they want to practice, focus on for the week, and which activities they want to practice in. And then they help the parent complete a practice plan with a sequence graphic that helps walk them through what it might look like to use those techniques in that activity that the parent has chosen. The coach then does some active problem solving to help the parent think about what might be challenging using those strategies in that activity over the next week, and then assigns the reflection and reading for the next session. So we've conducted research on the 3 different versions of the coaching model, really looking at the degree to which the coaching model is successful at helping the parent learn the strategies and its impact on child social communication. So I'm going to just talk really briefly about some of the research we've done on each of these different coaching models. Our first study really was on the individual coaching model, and this was a single case design study across 8 families. And we were really interested in the effect of the coaching model as originally designed, which is twice a week for 12 weeks, versus an adapted version where the parent learns the strategies once a week for 12 weeks. And we made this adaptation because we had a lot of community providers saying, you know, we really can't meet with families twice a week. Our program really only allows us to do it once a week. So before making those recommended adaptations, we wanted to make sure that parents could still learn the strategies if they were only getting 1 session a week. And then we also examined the association between the parents' use of the intervention strategies and their child's language. So we really wanted to know, is there a relationship between the parents' fidelity in using the strategies and the child's language gains? And what we found was we found increases in parent fidelity, which was great. That means the parents were able to learn to use the strategies with a greater degree of fidelity after coaching. We also found improvements in child language, which was great. We found also that parent responsiveness and prompting were associated with child language gains. So when we looked at the relationship between parent fidelity and child communication, we found that there were specific strategies that the parents were using that were directly related to the child's communication skills. So this gives us additional evidence that those intervention techniques that we saw evidence for working when implemented by a provider are also related to those intervention techniques when being used by a parent. And then finally, we found when we compared parent learning and fidelity for the twice-a-week model versus the once-a-week model, we found that parents can learn the strategies similarly well when the program has been adapted to cover slightly more techniques in a little bit of a faster way. And so we felt pretty confident that the intervention can be delivered in a once-a-week model. We were also interested in looking at the impact of the group coaching model. So this was more of a feasibility study. It was less controlled, but we used a pre-post test design where we had 3 early intervention, early childhood special education programs that participated. So 3 different districts with a total of 24 families. And we provided training and assistance in implementation, but the providers were the ones that were implementing the program, not us. And what we found is we saw a high rate of families complete the program. So that suggests that this program can be feasibly implemented in a community setting. The families that participated rated the treatment very high in acceptability, as well as the providers. So the providers also felt this was an acceptable intervention to use within this classroom-based model. We saw improvements in parent fidelity and decreases in parenting stress. And then we also saw improvements in child language. So this is more, as I said, a feasibility study. We didn't have a control group, but we did find that this group model could be used effectively within a community setting. And then finally, we've done some work on the telehealth model. We published a pilot randomized control trial with 27 families. We also are currently conducting a full-scale randomized control trial that has an additional control group. And so we're still in the process of running that study. But we actually can talk a little bit about some of the data we've had so far from the pilot study. In the pilot study, half of the families were randomly assigned to receive a self-directed online tutorial that provided self-guided instruction in the intervention. And the tutorial included a narrated slideshow with video examples. It included the manual. It also included practice planning to allow the parents to develop a practice plan and opportunities to reflect, so a reflection section. And then it also had some embedded interactive examples and activities and self-check questions to really help parents apply that information to their child. But the self-directed tutorial group got just the tutorial and they didn't have any coach support. The therapist assistance group also received the self-directed tutorial, but then they met with the therapist over Zoom twice a week. I mentioned a little earlier that first session was to review the tutorial and really talk about it in more detail, and the second session of the week was to practice with their child while they received feedback over Zoom. So from the pilot study, we found that, interestingly, parents in both groups had similar improvements in a knowledge or understanding of the intervention. However, when we looked at parent fidelity, the degree to which the parents were using the intervention strategies, we did see greater gains in the intervention fidelity for the parents who received therapist assistance. So that that coaching and feedback seems to be really important to help parents really take the information that they learn and apply it in their interactions with their child. And this is not surprising to us, as there's quite a bit of research out there to suggest the importance of that coaching element for really changing parent behavior. We also found similar improvements in parenting stress and self-efficacy in both groups, which was somewhat surprising to us. We thought we might see greater gains in self-efficacy in the families who received coaching. But it does seem, at least in this pilot study, that simply learning the strategies really helps parents feel more self-efficacious and can lead to some reductions in parenting stress like we had seen in the group program. We found similar improvements in child communication. So on the Vineland adaptive behavior scales, children made significant changes from pre to post, but they did in both groups. We thought that was interesting. There was a trend towards the parents who had been in the therapist-assisted group having the children having a slightly greater improvement in their language use with the parent during a parent-child interaction, but that was trending towards significance. It didn't meet significance. But we did see some evidence of a small advantage for the coaching group for changes on socialization on the Vineland adaptive behavior scale. So that does suggest that some of this coaching may be particularly helpful for parents using strategies with their child to elicit long-term or broader gains in their child's social communication skills. And as I said, we're still in the midst of a full-scale randomized controlled trial that will also include a control group so that we can determine whether these gains that we're seeing within this program are specific to this program or whether they're due to just general trends and changes over time. So I wanted to show you some examples of what the coaching looks like in this program. So here is an example of coaching from that study that we did of our individual coaching model, and you'll see some elements of coaching done live.
So that's great. So were there any other questions or comments or anything about setting up the home?
I don't think so.
Have you tried kind of organizing the toys at all? Right. Where did Sweet go? Here's Sweet. Huh? Well, let's Sweet move. Sweet. That's Sweet. Yeah. Here's Sweet. There's Sweet. Oh, there's Sweet. There you go, Sweet. Oh, good Sweet. Oh, it's Sweet. He has a window. Yeah. Good job, buddy. So that can be something in terms of the toys, like when you guys actually start playing in the office space, that might be something to try to do too. And then, like we had talked about, kind of maybe rotating the toys or kind of making them less available to him so that he can't just like drop and then move on to the next thing or those sorts of things.
Definitely. And that's something I've noticed a long time ago does better when he has less to choose.
Yeah.
If there's a ton of stuff out available, it's just a mess and chaos. And
And so, I mean, you see we use these bins all the time because they're so good because it's like you can just throw a bunch of stuff in them, put the top on.
Right.
And then easily pull out a couple toys.
We do have a bin in that room, something like that, but it's a really big one. And at the end of the day, we just like cram anything that's been played with it. So it's just like overflowing with toys. So maybe a smaller one where we have less to put away and then put the big one like down in the basement.
Yeah, that's a great idea actually. And then every couple weeks you can, switch out the toys in the smaller bin and bring it back upstairs or something like that. That's a great idea. So try that. Okay. Let me know how that goes. Kids a lot of times are used to us asking them, oh, do that, why can you do this? But it's very rare that they actually have the experience of an adult imitating what they're doing. So for a lot of kids, this is like a really new kind of thing. They're like, this is, it increases imitation skills. We're showing them how to imitate somebody else and how to do it in a social way. It increases appropriate behaviors. So if there are things we'd like him to do more of by imitating that, that's going to get him to increase his use of that. And then also, again, when we're thinking about how to increase the spontaneous use of skills like language and play, it's a great way to do it because you're kind of stepping back, you're doing what he's doing, you're encouraging him, but he's, again, the one that's really not yet. So in terms of, in terms of imitating, we want to start by thinking about imitating his play with toys. So seeing how he's playing with toys and then kind of doing the same thing. We also can imitate his body movement. So he's not really that interested in toys. Like if he's doing his Tai Chi thing, kind of get up there and do that with him. Also his kind of vocalizations for Jack, because he does have a lot of really good language. I wouldn't say you necessarily want to imitate kind of everything, especially his scripted language, because that's going to make that increase.
Right.
When he does use communicative, meaningful language, to kind of imitate that, repeat that back to him, and show him like that's meaningful, and I hear that. So any questions about imitating? It's pretty straightforward, and it's kind of weird to do at first. But again, I actually noticed you doing a lot of this already, so. And again, this kind of goes along with just it's a way to kind of follow your child's lead and make sure that Jack is really kind of the one who's deciding what we're doing.
So I'll just demonstrate a little bit if there's any choice here that he still is interested in. If not, we can pull out some new ones. And then I'll have you and you practice while I kind of coach you with some feedback. And then we'll have you guys do the 10-minute session. Okay, so see, you know, we can put the toys out, see what he's interested in, but he seems to really like these. So I'm going to kind of join him around this. One for Jack, one for Allie. Oh, we can join them, put them together. Good idea. I'm going to get some other ones for me since you just took those.
Wow, down.
Oh, it's flying. So he's kind of watching when I'm doing a little bit. He's sort of like, what did she do? This is weird. But he still seems to be really interested in this. And he's watching what I'm doing, but he's not paying a whole lot of attention to me. So I'm going to keep doing this for a little bit and see if I can get some engagement from him. A little bit more than him just watching my toy. And if not, you know, I might try to bring something else and just see. Jack, why don't you come on the floor? It's easier to play that way. You can bring that there. And again, I'm going to try to stay face to face with him like we talked about last time. Oh, yellow.
Fruit salad.
So like when you pick up an apple, you can feel free to pick up another piece of fruit and kind of show them, yeah, I'm pulling these things apart.
Apple. Pepper.
Pepper.
Pepper. Chicken. Chicken.
So pick up a piece and imitate him doing that. Just looking at it.
Oh, you took my bread. Where's my bread? Oh, you took my bread.
He's a piece of that too.
Oh, you took my bread. I'm going to take watermelon. You took my watermelon.
He's taking great time to be
All done? Hey. Take some salad.
That was great when he did that. He was looking for me.
You took my watermelon. My carrot! Where's my carrot? Oh, tomato. My tomato. Oh. You ate tonight? Oh my!
Here he's just looking at you this whole time. You're like, this is so silly.
I'm full. Oh, my tummy's full.
Oh. He's like, no, we're still playing tonight.
Oh, you took my bread. Where's my bread? You make a sandwich for Tom and Jerry?
It's a tie.
Tom and Jerry.
It's a tie.
Oh, you're gonna eat Tom and Jerry on a sandwich? I'll make a sandwich too.
Great, perfect.
I'll make a watermelon sandwich and a carrot sandwich.
Mine.
Where's mine? I don't have an apple.
Take mine.
So one thing I noticed is that I know he does have trouble taking turns, but that was just 3 minutes almost of back and forth turn taking because you were kind of imitating exactly what he was doing, and so it became this really fun and exciting game. So he was willing to do that just about turn taking with you, which is great to see. You did a great job. So now he seems to kind of be stacking some things. So you could, you know, maybe take some and stack some things yourself too. Awesome.
Apple, apple. No, it's falling apart. You ate Tom and Jerry. I ate an apple.
Other choice with fish. So that was really nice to see because we didn't start to kind of tune in and stack, but then as soon as you stack something else down, you went right after it. Oh, let's play a little bit more here, and then we'll go next.
So you could see a lot of the same elements that I described in that session in terms of the practice plan review, the introducing new technique, the modeling or demonstrating the intervention strategies with the parent, and then that active parent practice with provider feedback. I'm going to just show you a really brief clip of what this would look like when done over telehealth. So here we have a mother and her daughter. What you're only going to see is you're going to see a little bit of the review, practice plan review, and then you're going to see a little of the active coaching. And again, you can see the mother is going to be getting the same information from the coach, but instead of having the coach be there live, the coach is actually here on the screen and is doing this coaching remotely.
Yeah. No, but now that she's talking so much more, she's using communication so much more. It's like you kind of get used to her talking. Yeah. Which is awesome. That's great.
She's saying like numbers, the word numbers. Oh, I know. She said hat on and put a hat on, and then she said hat, and then she walked over to a rocking horse and she put it on the rocking horse and said hat on the rocking horse. Yeah, she's been pointing a lot too. What? Yeah.
Kimmy, that was so good that you waited till she gave you the word instead of just accepting her kind of speech screeching. That was great.
Now she just said it 4 times. More bubble, more bubble, more. 1, yes, 1. Okay. 1. That's it. 1. 1. More bubbles. More good. More. I don't want bubble.
That is awesome. With a point, and she looked right at you.
So you can see here, even though the coaching is happening remotely, the process actually looks really similar. And we've actually found, particularly with COVID, where many providers who were doing in-person coaching using Project ImPACT had to switch pretty quickly to telehealth coaching, we've actually found that it's been actually surprisingly similar way of implementing Project ImPACT, and that providers in many cases are finding that they're able to access families better using that telehealth component. So I did want to mention a little bit, some of those early studies are really focused on what material we had in our first edition of the manual. We actually do have a second edition, and the second edition of our manual that just came out in 2019 was actually informed quite a bit by research done by collaborators of ours, as well as some of our own research, and as part of the process of developing the telehealth version. So what we were able to do with all of that work was incorporate that into our second edition. So I just wanted to highlight a little bit. We do have some collaborators. Aubin Stamer really led this project. This was the development of Project ImPACT for toddlers, which was an adapted version based on taking the first edition of Project ImPACT and making it more appropriate for children receiving services in Part C or 0 to 3. So this is the Southern California Bridge Collaborative, and they did develop this, this collaborative as a community academic partnership with the specific goal of improving intervention for toddlers with or at risk for ASD in Part C. And they were really interested in selecting an evidence-based parent-mediated intervention that could be used in community settings. So they conducted a needs assessment, and then they had local consensus discussion to inform the selection of the program. They did end up choosing Project ImPACT at that time, and then they made adaptations to Project ImPACT's, the first edition, to really increase its fit for the Part C system. They developed some really nice visuals that aided in teaching. They were able to simplify some of the intervention strategy techniques. They identified those techniques that may be less appropriate for 0 to 3 children. And so we were able to use quite a bit of that input when we were thinking about our second edition. In addition, one of my graduate students, Catherine Picard, who has since left and is beginning a position at Emory, did some research to understanding how might we adapt that first edition to make it more appropriate for the Medicaid system in Michigan. And in Michigan, the Medicaid system is the primary system that funds ABA services for low-income children in the state of Michigan. So she was particularly interested in thinking about how this program might work within that system. And to do this, she conducted focus groups with parents and providers who were receiving ABA services or delivering ABA services through the Michigan Medicaid Autism Benefit. And to do this, she developed a 10-minute video of Project ImPACT based on that first edition that introduced the goals of the program, the techniques of the program, strategies used, and presented it to the focus groups, and then asked them to talk about it. What do they like about it? What did they think would be appropriate for using in that system with their children, with the families they work with? What things would need to be changed to make it more of a better fit for their system? And she identified through these focus groups a number of elements related to the intensity at which the program was delivered. As I said, initially we had planned on doing it twice a week for 12 weeks, but some of the providers indicated and some of the families indicated that that was just too frequent for that system. There was a desire for more routines-based instruction, a movement away from focusing as much on play and more on family routines. Increased flexibility in terms of the way in which providers move through the program, allowing providers to maybe cover less strategies in more detail, making the materials far more simple, an increased emphasis on visual learning and visual mnemonics, and then strategies that could particularly support providers in actively engaging parents, and then an emphasis on the need for additional modules to support behavior management. So to determine whether or not this information, if we were to incorporate it into the program, would actually have its intended effect, she conducted a follow-up study to examine how these adaptations might influence uptake. So she recruited 103 parents of children with ASD between the ages of 2 and 8, which would be the target range for this program. And they were randomly assigned to view either that video of the original program or a video she developed of a program that was adapted to reflect those elements that were identified in the focus groups. And so they got to view one of the two videos, and then they rated what they perceived to be barriers to the program, aspects of the program attributes, as well as if they were offered this program, to what extent would they intend to use it. And what she found was that the program type, adapted versus original, was significantly associated with reductions in perceived barriers, an improvement in positive program attributes that are associated with uptake, and then a higher level of intent to use. And there was also an interaction between families' annual income and the program type, such that families that were had a lower annual income were more likely to find improved program attributes and had a higher likelihood of intending to use it when they saw the adapted program than when they saw the traditional program. And that was particularly important for families from a lower socioeconomic background. So these data suggest that those intended adaptations actually would likely improve parents' willingness to participate in this type of program. So we were able to integrate the data from our telehealth trial, where we already had to make some adaptations to make it be delivered online, with the Bridge Collaborative's Project ImPACT for Toddlers, which made it more appropriate for 0 to 3 and younger children, as well as the adaptations which we identified from working with the community mental health system, and we incorporated it into our second edition. And the key elements that that sort of are aspects of the second edition are that we've made some language changes that make it appropriate for younger children, including children without a diagnosis of ASD. So we've taken out the word autism in it, and it's all focused on social communication challenges. We've dramatically simplified the language, reduced writing requirements for the practice plans, and increased the use of visuals. We've also allowed for more flexible use, so we've grouped those individual techniques into what we call the Project ImPACT facts, which are the broader strategies, which is what I talked about when I talked about the intervention strategies at the beginning. There's much more focus on teaching in routines other than play. There's also explicit guidance on how providers might adapt the program for different lengths of time. And we have added in quite a few more strategies for engaging and empowering parents, as well as a lesson on managing challenging behavior. So really the take-home message from all of the work that we've done on looking at the intervention program as a whole is that really it's really important to make sure that we're addressing barriers to participation, particularly in community settings that are serving families that are not able to access services as well. This is important to, as part of this process, develop a partnership with the parent to help engage them in the program. We do this by developing goals collaboratively, and it's really important in our parent-mediated interventions to use systematic instruction while emphasizing practice with feedback. And we think these aspects are really important for any type of parent-mediated intervention, and we've worked very hard to try to incorporate them into Project ImPACT. The last thing I just wanted to highlight really quickly is the provider preparation models. So we have been focused on trying to understand the best ways to prepare community providers to implement Project ImPACT. And this is based on some of the work that we've seen about community providers really struggling to do parent-mediated intervention because they haven't had pre-service training in this area. So we've really tried to think about what are best practices in preparing providers to be able to implement this program with the families they work with. And we've developed a model where we've tried to focus on as much use of technology as possible to keep the barriers low. So the first stage is we have providers complete an online tutorial. It's 6 hours, and it introduces the intervention strategies in more detail. So it uses video examples, narrated slideshows, self-check questions, interactive activities, so that the providers really understand the intervention techniques that they're going to be teaching parents. We then have them come to an introductory workshop. And these two elements together actually comprise what we call introductory training. In the introductory workshop, they learn more about the intervention and the coaching strategies. And we have a much heavier focus on sort of active learning, really helping them take the information that they learned on the tutorial and apply it. So we have more role play activities, active learning, and we also end the workshop by helping them really think through how they might implement this program in their active setting or in their practice setting. And so typically the workshop has been a 2-day workshop, but now that we've moved virtual with COVID, it's a 4 half-day workshop. And then what we know from our research as well as other research on training is that workshops in and of themselves are usually insufficient to produce real change in provider behavior. So we've also developed a consultation model where providers have consultation meetings with Project ImPACT trainers. This involves video review of the providers using the intervention in the community, and active feedback from the trainer to help them increase their fidelity of implementation, and then their fidelity of implementation checks built in. So we've actually done some evaluation of an individual consultation model where providers meet over once a month over 6 months with an individual trainer. And they submit video all the way along. We've also piloted a group consultation model that is focused on trying to do this for a larger number of providers who all work within a single organization. So some of the evaluation we did of the training model that involved the individual consultation is we did a study, a quasi-experimental design with 3 sites and 30 providers who worked at quite different backgrounds. We had an EI program that participated, we had a hospital-based clinic that participated, and we had a autism agency that participated. So we were able to train providers who work in various types of community settings. And we were really looking at the relative benefit of that online self-directed tutorial versus participating in the workshop versus the added benefit of individual consultation. And what we found was the online tutorial and the workshop together were effective for increasing provider self-efficacy. So after going through the online tutorial and then the workshop, providers felt much more efficacious and competent in their ability to deliver Project ImPACT. However, when we looked at their fidelity, although we did see some improvements in fidelity with participating in the tutorial and the workshop, consultation was really necessary for providers to achieve fidelity. And this isn't really surprising to us because this is something that we've seen in a variety of research looking at training community providers in novel interventions. So this does suggest that that introductory training is very important for getting parent providers to feel comfortable to use this type of model. But when we're really thinking about really increasing provider fidelity, we probably want to add in that consultation component. And I know that one of the other talks in this series, local implementation of Project ImPACT in infant and toddler intervention phase 2, that's being presented by Jeanette Newman and Melanie Palacia, will talk a bit more about the group consultation model experience, which we piloted in the Philly infant and toddler program. So they'll be able to talk a little bit more about what Project ImPACT was like on the ground. Based on that. So I encourage you to watch that if you're interested in Project ImPACT. And I just want to end by acknowledging my collaborators in this work. Obviously, the program was developed by Anna Dvorak along with me, and so she has had a significant impact on all the work that has been done on this program. I also want to acknowledge Alban Stamer and the Bridge Collaborative, who've been important in bringing in elements of Project ImPACT for toddlers, as well as Barb Groom, who's a member of the Mid-State Health Network, who's really key in helping us develop some of our work in the community mental health system. And then I also want to highlight my lab members, the graduate students that have worked with me, the undergrads who've participated in this work. I particularly want to highlight the work of the folks that I presented here today. So Allie Weiner, who was involved in leading the evaluation of our consultation model, Catherine Picard, who was involved in leading the work on the adaptations for community mental health, and then Carice Casagrande and Deandra Straighton, who led some of the work on understanding how parent training is used in health settings. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.